Okay, that's about it. Dawn, do you have any other announcements? Okay, then we're going to pop right into the message. And today, if you open up to the book of Exodus or to Psalm 91 to begin with, but then to the book of Exodus, you will be in a really good place as we move forward in our study this morning. I talked about the storms which are being unleashed in our culture. Without being at all prophetic, I am telling you there's more storms coming. Okay, we live in a world that is slowly but surely achieving a desired end. It's happened years ago. When in the past, I was at I attended a seminar online. Karen did too, but they did kind of a history, and I knew about the history of public education in the United States, but they talked about the purpose for it. Before public education started in the United States, we were known as one of the most educated countries in the world. Before public education. And 98% of everyone could write cursive well in the United States of America. Our education system was second to none. In fact, people would come to the United States and they'd say, this education system is stunning. The problem with it, though, is it was mostly Christian. And there were people that didn't like that because they knew as long as the United States remained a Christian nation, it would be a strong nation, and it would not be something that you could co-opt. And so they began moving toward some of them were avowed communists, names that you know that we have put on high schools. Avowed communists, avowed Marxists, because their goal was to weaken the United States. And so they brought in public education, which at first is no big deal. In fact, a lot of Christians were for the public education when it first came in, because you know how it's sold. Why wouldn't you want everyone to get educated? Forgetting that 97% of the population was already well educated. Okay, but just in case there's a little bit of people that just aren't making it, we got to change everything, and that's what happened. Yesterday at the seminar, one of the people said, and I knew this already, most of the church went along with it, in fact supported it, but there were a few examples of churches that said, no, this is dangerous. I grew up in one of those systems. The Lutheran Church started its own education system. And the whole system I went through, every larger Lutheran church, conservative Lutheran churches, Missouri Synod, Wisconsin Synod, I was in Wisconsin, but even the what we'd call today the more liberal ones had their education systems at least at a little higher level. And but those systems were put in place because of the fact that they said this is a bad deal because eventually the government's going to tell us we can't teach our principles, which is exactly what happened. You know, prayer got taken out of school, Bible readings got stopped, all by court order in the early 60s. And Christians, rather than responding to that and saying, I'm taking my kids out, said, okay, well, we'll be the salt and the light. One of the people yesterday said, there ain't no salt and light possible anymore. You need to get your kids out of public education. That was what one of the speakers said, bottom line. And by the time he said it, it was he had presented enough evidence that you're like, you know, that face on the emojis that looks, you know, like, okay. And so, but everyone's got to make that decision, of course, for themselves. But it's pretty difficult right now when you look at what is being taught. Good news, Florida, 20% of the students in Florida are being homeschooled right now. And that's amazing. And that's being taken out from what has become an indoctrination system rather than, and by the way, I've known all this for yesterday's seminar, okay? I was well aware of what's going on in our education system, just not the specific examples that are going on right now. It's been amped up in a big way. I think it was in, Karen, are you in the room? Okay, was it Pasco County where the guy was fired because he wouldn't go into the locker room? Do you remember that? In Florida, I think it was Pasco County, because I was writing the material down, and then all of a sudden I realized, oh, what was the county? And I wrote Pasco, so it must have been said recently. But this is what happened. A transgender young lady, and when I mention a transgender whatever, I'm always going to speak about their biological sex. Okay, so it's a young lady who said, I identify as a male, wanted to go into the boys' locker room after, sweating and everything, doing whatever the exercise program was. And the school superintendents, the people in charge, said, well, if he goes into the locker room, he could be badgered by those who are troglodytes, right? That now all of a sudden, catcalls or whatever. I mean, so we can't have that. And so they tasked a male teacher to go into the locker room with that biologically female student. And the male teacher, which means he would have gone into a locker room with a young woman who would have disrobed. By the way, it used to be you go to jail for that. Okay. He was not only fired, because he wouldn't do it, they have tried to destroy his life as an example of the fact that he has to be made an example of, you don't oppose what we're doing. That one to me was one where I went, wow, you can't even take a stand for righteousness without having this steamroller crush you. In California right now, 27% of the students in K through 12 identify as non-gender conforming. Think about that. Transgender is in our population small percentage. But now to have that much in one area, and California is kind of leading the way for the entire nation. If it happens there, it's happening everywhere. The 70% of millennials state that in the future they will vote for a socialist. It's because Marxism has been pushed in the schools and the National Education Association for a long time right now. And so that mindset is there. By the way, Marxism is the beast. Okay, you do need to understand that. It's when the government steps in. Revelation 13 and on is clear. When the government steps in and takes the place of God's people by saying, I'll be your source, and begins to declare, and it destroys free property rights or sovereign property rights, which is really a scriptural thing, and does all that, that is the definition of the beast. And obviously over 100 million people have been killed in Marxist societies in the last century. And that is, it's not a neutral philosophy. It's a difficult philosophy, unless it's done right, as someone always tells me. And unfortunately, we have human beings who are not that, they're sinful. They're sinful. Now, by the way, we can practice, as they did in the New Testament, the whole idea of helping and blessing. As we have been blessed, Christianity always shares. Christianity always gives. Christianity always helps those who are less fortunate. And that should be the spirit of our culture and our society, but that's not the spirit of the culture and the society right now. And that's, whenever someone's proposing forcing people to share, I say, you first. Have you been sending extra money in with your taxes? Anyway, we are in the midst of a cultural shaking. And unfortunately, we're the peacemakers. That's not unfortunate. That's our job. But it's hard to be a peacemaker if you're filled with fear. Okay? And that's what today's message is about. It's about saying we don't have to have fear. No matter what happens. Guys, we can thrive in a Marxist society. We can thrive in a communist society. We can thrive because the church thrives when it's the church. Look at what's going on in China right now. The church is persecuted, and yet it is thriving. We pray for them. We don't want them to be persecuted, but the truth is it's thriving. If China never becomes a problem, a major problem in the world, some people would say it's there already, but if it never becomes a major problem in the world, it's going to be because of that church in China, which has major authority to pray. And they've been praying in an amazing way. But it's hard to be able to be the peacemakers that you've been called to be if you are afraid. And so today we're talking about God and about what he does for his people. Okay. I have entitled today's message, Living Above a Shaking World. Well, I've got the word shakes in there twice. Anyway, living above a shaking world. That's shaking when it shakes. Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of hungry for a milkshake right now, aren't you? I'm thinking that'd work. Okay, and we are going to be looking at Exodus, but like I said, we're going to start in Psalm 91. I just want to remind us of these scriptures, not spending a long time on them today. But the one who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to Yahweh, you are my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. So we've got abiding in the secret place of God, because the secret place, abiding in God is always a secret place. It's a personal connection between you and God. And so if you abide in the secret place, by the way, all the way through today, you're going to see the word Yahweh up there. If you haven't seen that before, or you say, what is that? That is the appropriate way of pronouncing what was written in the King James Version, Jehovah. It is the personal name of God. It is in the Bible 7,000 times. The personal name of God. Most translations just translated capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. And the King James Version translated it Jehovah 7 times out of the 7,000 times. And usually like Jehovah Jireh, that type of stuff. That is how they did it. So, but anyway, I'll always put God's personal name up there. I won't give into the Tetragrammaton where they call it's called the Tetragrammaton, but I won't give into where the capital L, capital O, capital R, and capital D are used instead of God's personal name, especially because of the fact when you look up this word, you'll find that God says to Moses, I didn't reveal myself as Yahweh to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Moses, I'm revealing myself as Yahweh, my personal name. I'm letting you know that, which means he felt it was a special privilege to let Moses and subsequent generations know his name. So if God says it's a special privilege to know his name, it's probably a good thing for us to know his name, which is why I translate it that way. Okay, it says those who are in that secret place of God are they're in the shadow of the Almighty, and they abide in the secret place. He's their refuge and their fortress. It doesn't say, if you abide in the secret place and you have a government which is just exactly the way you want it, or there aren't people rioting in the streets, or there aren't, no. It says no matter what's going on, he's your refuge and your fortress. And so you can look to him always as the one who's going to be watching over you. You can trust. That's what the whole Psalm 91 is about, trust. And so no matter what happens in our culture, no matter what shaking happens, no matter how things change or how matter things don't change, you can always trust God to be the one who is in control. Verses 5 and 6, I just quickly added this one because it's so pertinent, these verses. You will not be intimidated by the terror of night, nor by the arrow that flies by day, nor the pandemic that makes its way in the darkness, nor the pestilence that destroys at the middle of the day. So, our pandemic moments happen. Okay. Psalm 91, then verse 9 and 12 says, since you made the Most High your shelter, Yahweh, who is my refuge, no evil will fall upon you and no plague will come near your tent. For he will command his angels on your behalf that they guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you don't strike your foot against a stone. Means there's no lasting harm. His angels are on duty over you, and they're good at their job. I mean, they so that you don't strike your foot against the stone. Now remember, one of Satan's temptations of Jesus was, hey, because his angels are doing this, why don't you just throw yourself off the temple? And Jesus did say, don't put the Lord your God to the test. Okay, so, don't throw yourself off a 2-story building saying the angels will get me, unless there's a raging fire behind you. Then, of course, you can. The angels will catch me. That's not presumption, although you'd probably kind of let yourself down by your fingertips first, as far as you can. But they're good at their job. Last night there was a glass sitting on the counter, and there was a rack that I was grabbing for, and as I touched the rack, it fell. It hit the glass and shattered it. You know what you do when you see a glass tipping, right? You reach in. And I mean, this glass broke in such a way that it was jagged edges all around, and it went right there. Okay? And so I looked at my hand, and it hit me here in the palm and there in the wrist. And I went, ooh, this could be bad. And I looked, and I actually went, because I figured it could have sliced me. Looks like I got a little red mark right there. But anyway, I thought it could have sliced me pretty bad. And I looked, and I went, oh, well, thank God the angels were at work today. Because it certainly wasn't my doing. I did the normal stupid thing. When a glass is breaking, you don't reach for it. You let it break because it's not worth the stitches or worse that could be coming. And but they did a great job last night. Kudos. My hat. I just doff my hat to them. Since I don't really wear a hat, it's hard to doff any hats. But okay. Okay, so now I want to talk about the shaking of Egypt today. That's why we're in Exodus. We're going to talk about a whole nation shaking. And in many ways, that could be our country in the future because there's such a tumult and such a turmoil right now of what's going on. I can tell you, no matter which way our country goes in the future, there's going to be a shaking. Whether it heads back to the principles that it was grown on or whether it keeps going forward into more of the progressive areas, we're going to have a shaking. That's obvious. The sides are lining up. Do you know one of the... I'm not going to say the scariest things because it makes it sound like I'm terrified, but I'm not. One of the concerning things as you look at what's going on in our culture right now is all of the states that are saying we're going to file 10th Amendment lawsuits, so we're going to become Second Amendment sanctuaries or First Amendment sanctuaries. And they've stated publicly they're not going to enforce federal mandates in their states on certain issues. Well, you do understand the Civil War started over that. Okay, so, but you understand, a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln said to the South, you can't do that. And he sent federal troops to change it. So, when I talk about no matter which way it goes, and the shaking that could be upon us, be aware of what is being set up right now because of what is happening in our culture with political disagreement. Because when you've got states openly defying the federal government, a la what happened in the Civil War, things can get out of control really quickly. And that is problematic if you're living in one of those states, or if you're the state that's going to be the example, or if, that's being set up. You see it in the headlines every day right now, where a state is passing through its legislature to say, we're simply going to ignore those federal laws. And then if the federal government says, oh, no, you aren't, now what happens? Because how do you enforce it? So a culture can shake. Well, that's why we're looking at Egypt, because the entire nation shook. And yet there were a group of people living in it who were protected by God, who had been in slavery and had been oppressed, but God was going to free them through the shaking of the nation. Oh, isn't that interesting? You never know what God can do through the shaking of a nation. But in this instance, it's very clear what he did. So he sent 10 plagues to be able to free the people of Israel. When you look at the 10 plagues, except for the last one, it divides very nicely into 3 separate groups. There was the blood, the frogs, the fleas. You might have translated them as gnats in your own version, okay? Then there were the flies, livestock disease, which was probably marine, and boils, and then the hail, the locust, and the darkness. And they're increasing intensity in their everything that's going along. The sets of 3 before the final one, and they go from irritations to destructions to absolute calamities for the nation. They're just ratcheted up, every one of those triptychs, every one of the 3s. So, that is what we're looking at today. We're just going to look at each one of the plagues and what they did and what God did for his people in each of the plagues. Because it's going to teach us about what happens if we live in a nation that's shaking, what can we expect to have to put up with? And we got some pretty good biblical precedents with what we see going on in the land of Goshen. We live in supernatural economy. We expect God to help us live above whatever the shaking that's going on in the culture. We're planted firmly on the rock. But that doesn't mean that there won't be times that we experience the common irritations in the culture. For instance, toilet paper might be scarce. That's just a thing. I don't think that would ever really happen. By the way, there really was never a shortage. It's because of the hoarding. that was motivated by fear. So that created the shortage. So anyway, we are in Exodus chapter 7, just 2 verses to be able to highlight the first plague. And thus Moses and Aaron did what Yahweh commanded. Moses lifted up his staff and struck the waters of the Nile in front of the eyes of Pharaoh and his servants, and all the waters in the Nile turned to blood. The fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile smelled so awful that the Egyptians were not able to drink water from it. The blood was in all the land of Egypt. Now, by the way, Pharaoh's servants, probably his officials, but it's actually the word servants. That's what I've left it as. So anyway, we've got this situation where the Nile turns to blood. Very few, even extremely conservative commentators believe it was literal, human blood or animal blood, but that it's some type of thing that God did. And there's some ways that some things that could have happened that made the Nile turn red and made it stink and all of that stuff. And so we'll find out when we get in the presence of God. If it was literal blood, the moon turns to blood too, but it's not literal blood. Yeah, some kind of algae is what most people think. So even a plankton. So, but all of that to say that this was what happened to the river because of it. It looked like blood, and it was stinking and awful, and it wasn't. It was awful. So throughout the entire land. So they did their staff thing. The water turned to blood, or whatever looked like blood, and because of that, there was all sorts of dead fish. And have you ever been around stinking dead fish? You walk in, you go, that's not very pleasant. Can you imagine a whole land smelling like that? Because the Nile was connected throughout the land through the canal system and the watering system. And so everywhere, because remember, this is not this isn't like South Florida where there's inundating rain all the time. That's not what happened there and happens. The canal systems are what helps bring irrigation, just like in Israel, to the nation, in California, that whole area, to the agricultural areas. And now all of that is filled with that stinking, reeking, and so it was pretty unpleasant. So horrible smell, dead fish. But they could dig for water. So they had water, they just had to go through the irritation of digging for water. Now, here's the thing that we need to understand. This also affected the Israelites. It was nasty, but not fatal. All they had to do was go through the extra work of digging wells next to the Nile so that the water from the bottom, the filtered or purified water that would be leaking out the bottom of the river, or from the springs which are there, they were able to drink the water then. It wasn't like the whole nation was going to suddenly die of dehydration. They were able to dig for water. Okay, remember the Egyptian magicians were able to do this same type of thing, whatever it was, and so that Pharaoh was able to harden his heart. First plague, an irritation, not very pleasant at all, but not what you'd label a calamity. It was just not nice. So Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then it says, then Yahweh spoke to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams, rivers, and pools, and make frogs go up upon the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs went up and covered the land of Egypt. And I know some of you are saying, man, think of all the frog legs. You know the only problem? Just like if you're in India and you see a cow walking down the road, you don't eat it because it's sacred. So were frogs. So they couldn't eat these frogs, because that's one of the ways to get rid of something is to make it a part of your menu. Right? That's in so invasive species. If there's an invasive species, you try to figure out a way to eat it. And that happens whether it's an invasive fish or an invasive iguana. Remember the recipes they were putting in the newspaper last year about the tail of these iguanas are really tasty. So, and there's secret recipes coming from the islands that you would just adore. Usually involving a whole lot of heat when you bite into them, though. I have figured that out. So, okay. So anyway, the frogs were sacred to the Egyptians, so they came up on the land. They were everywhere. Can you imagine? You ever walked outside your door and you got one of those tree frogs planted on the side of your door, and as soon as it sees you, it jumps right at you? You think that demon-possessed little thing what's it doing coming right at me? Well, imagine having a whole, they were everywhere. Just frogs. It'd be like, and they're not nice, and they're pooping and urinating on everything. It's just So it was, and by the way, again, this was up in Goshen, but it was just a froggy little plague. It wasn't, it was not convenient. And frogs, you could say, well, the Israelites weren't under and they weren't, but they probably would have said they're not clean, even though it was before the Mosaic Code. That it just wasn't something you would eat. Maybe they did. They maybe ate pig. Who knows? After the Mosaic Code, they wouldn't be eating frogs. But that was in the future yet. Okay, so this one Pharaoh did not respond to very well either. The Egyptian magicians were able to do the same thing. When the land is full of frogs, how can they conjure frogs? I don't know how they certainly were involved in their dark arts. That's what they're called, dark arts, which means that's the occult. And so they were able to do stuff, but also usually occult practitioners also do a lot of sleight of hand too, because they can't always trust on the fact that things are going to work the way they want. So next plague comes along because Pharaoh hardens his heart again. Yahweh spoke, this is Exodus 8:16-17. Yahweh spoke to Moses, say to Aaron, lift up your staff and strike the dust of the earth so it becomes fleas in all the land of Egypt. So they did this. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and fleas came up upon both man and cattle. All the dust of the earth became fleas in all the land of Egypt. Okay, most of your translations say gnats. The Septuagint says mosquitoes. By the way, they translated the Septuagint in 250 about BC. They're probably the closest, but even then, they didn't live in Egypt. They lived in Israel, so what was it? Mosquitoes were, of course, always a big deal. Gnats are annoying, especially if you got those little biting gnats, the ones I used to go fishing up in the northern waters of Wisconsin, and we'd fish because the best fishing, you're standing in the middle of the stream and you're fly fishing, and big wide open area, and the gnats would find you unerringly and they'd start to bite under your eyes. So the way that we would combat that is we'd get the cheapest cigars that we could get, because we're college students, college and seminary students. We didn't have a lot of money. So you'd buy these cheap, raunchy cigars, and you'd light one and keep it in your mouth, but you made sure the smoke was all around your head because it got rid of the gnats under your eyes. And so you were able to enjoy yourself, except for the fact that you were turning green. And so our joke was, you'd be sitting there and you'd have this thing and you'd be feeling sick. And you're fishing, and now it's getting so dark you can hardly see, and you'd say, this is the life. Okay. Fighting the gnats. So anyway, so the other option is the sand fleas, which of course is the option that I took. And I have sand fleas are nasty. You ever on a beach and you got sand fleas? They jump right on your legs and bite your legs like crazy. And they have them there too. So I lean toward the sand fleas, which the word can mean. Problem we got is that it's just not a word which is used with a lot of clarity, so you kind of picks your poison. And like I said, the Septuagint, and as you see, that's the Roman numeral for 70, because the Septuagint was translated by the 70 elders of Israel. And so they thought it was mosquitoes. So can you imagine being so many mosquitoes? Every exposed area of flesh has mosquitoes on it? Okay. Be bad enough with fleas. Fleas would probably get your lower extremities, though. Obviously, you've been around sand fleas. They're jumping on you, so they only get in your lower extremities, which is nasty enough. But the whole land, all the dust of the earth became fleas. So Pharaoh's magicians couldn't duplicate this one. So they called it the finger of God. Okay, they were honest enough to say, we can't do this one. And if they were into just chicanery, they probably would have just done something that they could do, but they couldn't do this one. So they said, this one's God. And Pharaoh still hardened his heart. And so you think to yourself, wow, fleas. Don't like fleas. But fleas are a nuisance. They're not like life-threatening. They're an irritation. So, now Pharaoh hardened his heart again. It says, for if you do not send my people out, look, I will send out swarms of biting flies over you. Your servants, your people, and your houses, the houses of the Egyptians will be full of swarms of biting flies. Doesn't that sound great? even the ground on which they live. In that day I will separate the land of Goshen where my people live. No swarming, biting flies will be there, so that you may know that I, Yahweh, am in the midst of it. I will provide redemption from between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign will occur. Ooh, this is a nasty one. This isn't just an inconvenience anymore. Okay, this is, pay attention. Flies carry disease. And nasty, swarming, biting flies carry a lot of disease. And more than likely, the plague of boils, which was coming, had its start right here, as the flies laid their eggs and did all of that. And so guess where the flies were not? In Goshen. Because this one wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a threat to life and limb. And so God made a distinction. I will separate the land of Goshen where my people live. You may know that I, Yahweh, am in the midst of the land of Goshen. Okay? He's saying, I'm there. Say, those biting flies can't come and trouble my people. I'm there. I will provide redemption between my people and your people. That's literally, the word is redemption. Most translations don't translate it that way because it's difficult to comprehend what the Lord's saying there. I will provide redemption. What he's saying is, I'll make sure that my people are protected. He's already leaning on Jesus coming in the future. His payment, I'm going to grab and already make sure that they don't deserve this because the debt's going to be paid for. That's what redemption does. It buys you back from the consequences of sin. And so he says, I'm going to provide redemption for the people of Israel now. And we know that every bit of redemption that was given to anybody was paid for at the cross. So anyway, the distinction was made between the people of Israel and Goshen, and you realize this is the first serious plague that would have had some major consequences for everyone involved. You know, having sandflies bite your legs, not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal if you're there. It is not fun. You know, the irritations, it's not fun. Frogs are not fun unless you really enjoy frog legs. Stinking dead fish, not fun. But none of it's life-threatening. This is life-threatening. And so the Lord was providing distinction. It says that Egypt was ruined. That's Exodus 8:24. Then Yahweh did this, and great swarms of biting flies came into the house of Pharaoh, the houses of his servants, and in all the land of Egypt, the land was ruined by the swarming, biting flies. And by the way, I translate it not just flies. It's really clear. Swarming, biting flies. Nasty. These were nasty critters that came upon the land of Egypt. Just don't think a bunch of fruit flies showed up. These are not fruit flies. These are dog flies, they might call them, something, but more like horse flies, of course, a biting fly, or a deer fly. So, you know, Pharaoh was in this thing right now where he was saying, yeah, no, maybe, not at all the way through all these plagues, and he always hardened his heart until we got to the big one. But then, if you refuse to send them out, this is again, he has said he's not going to do it. If you refuse to send them out and hold them longer, look, the hand of Yahweh will come against your livestock that is in the field, bringing a very severe pestilence. It will fall on your horses, donkeys, camels, herds, and flocks. But Yahweh will cause a separation between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt. Nothing will die that is owned by the sons of Israel. Now, pay attention to this one, because this is economic disaster coming on the land of Egypt. It's economic disaster. When you lose your cattle, and the time of year right now, it's the cattle in the field. Because Egypt has floods during the year because of the Nile, or back then, they would, a long time period each year, they would keep their cattle in their barns and stalls. But by this time of the year, there would be some that were out in the fields. Not all of them, but some. And those were the ones that were being talked about. They would get whatever disease was going to be called. So it was very clear it would be the livestock that is in the fields. And so all your livestock is going to get this problem. But nothing's going to die that belongs to the land of Israel. And so some type of moraine that was killing the animals as they were out there. It was devastating in its economic impact. I mean, just imagine all of a sudden you have this money on the hoof, and then it's dead. And it's worth nothing because it died of a disease. Now, by the way, by clear economic implication, if you suddenly have healthy animals in your land, and the people right next door to you don't have healthy animals, whose animals suddenly are worth more? Aha. Suddenly, Goshen has an economic impact. This distinction that God was doing brought prosperity to Israel. And that is a problem. Okay, they for the Egyptians. Okay, it was like, now they're upset. You know what Pharaoh did? He sends a team up there to investigate. Looks for carcasses. And there were none. Because none died. Now they come back and he's getting a little annoyed. But he's also realizing, my goodness, this is awful for our nation. So, okay, next plague. Exodus 9:8-9. Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from the kiln for yourselves, and Moses will toss it in the sky in front of Pharaoh. It'll become dust over all the land of Egypt. It will cover man and animals, causing boils and open sores to break out all over the land of Egypt. Well, that sounds like great fun. Okay. Soot from the kilns. Soot. Okay. You know what the kilns were for, right? Bricks. For baking bricks. That they were told they had to not have any straw for. And so this one is poetic. This one is really poetic. You were punishing my people, and now I'm going to take the soot from the kiln, the soot from the kilns that you were, and they scraped off double handfuls. It's very clear in the Hebrew that it was like double handfuls, and they probably put it in a box or a container, and they got in front of Pharaoh, and they threw it up in the air, and it becomes... It'll cover man and animals, causing boils and open sores to break out all over the land of Egypt. This is not fun, okay? This is causing personal pain. The magicians couldn't stand in front of Moses, he said. You know why? Because boils and open pain. There's a chance it was skin anthrax because of the flies, okay? And also because of the flies laying the eggs and doing all that sort of stuff. And I decided, because that's a pretty opportune diagnosis of what's going on with these people, I thought, what does skin anthrax look like? You don't want to look at the pictures before dinner, because it's bad. Okay, it's the boils are, blistering boils break out, and then they break out, and then they turn really dark. So if it was, but no matter what it was, boils that break out are not good. And so lots of personal pain, huge injury. Again, Goshen not impacted by this. The people of Israel were separate. Do you understand that when the people of Israel left Egypt, a lot of Egyptians went with them? You know why? They saw this distinction. They realized who's got the favor of God and who doesn't. And they knew they weren't the ones. So they wanted the favor of God. Why do you think the Egyptians were able to plunder? The Israelites were able to plunder the Egyptians. It's because they were saying, we're going to give you everything you want. Everything, because you've got so much favor with your God, maybe this will placate him. Okay? God said he will make their hearts disposed. So, we've got the boils breaking out. Nasty. Then, the next plague, chapter 9, verses 23 to 26. Moses stretched out his staff to the heavens. It's Moses now. Moses is like, Aaron, step out of the way. Remember the first ones was Aaron? Okay, he's gotten enough confidence now. Remember he had said, Aaron's going to be my mouthpiece, and then as the things go on, he gets more and more confidence from what God is doing, and he starts doing stuff himself. Moses stretched out his staff to the heavens, and Yahweh provided thunder and hail, and lightning walked along the ground. That's picturesque. Yahweh sent hail as rain upon the land of Egypt. There was hail and incessant lightning in the midst of the hail. It was the most severe storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. The hail struck everything in the field throughout the land of Egypt, both man and animal. The hail also struck down all the plants of the field and splintered all the trees. Only in the land of Goshen, where the sons of Israel were, it did not rain hail. It's picturesque. Instead of saying lightning walked along the ground, you could say lightning ran along the ground. I just used it real literally, but some of the commentators that they talk about this talk about ball lightning, as it's moving around, and it's a pretty interesting time. By the way, remember I had already told you what their climate is like. They didn't get this type of storm. This was not a storm that was normal. Never was, never would be, ever again, because of the fact that this was a supernatural storm from God. And it destroyed everything. Animals that had been let out after the last one, and more of them were let out to pasture, and they have to let them out to pasture because that's where the food is. And so they let them out to pasture, and the ones, remember, this is the one where the servants of Pharaoh, Moses warned Pharaoh of this one. And the servants of Pharaoh who realized, oh my goodness, this is going to happen, they got their cattle inside. And the ones that didn't have any fear of God yet, and you want to say to them, what are you thinking? Everything that Moses has said has happened. And so and all I can say is political correctness. I mean, honestly, that really is it. They're saying, if I bring my cattle in, I'm going to be demonstrating to Pharaoh I got some fear in my life, or I'm listening, they're heeding this, and so I can't do that, even though it would only make sense to be able to bring the cattle in after everything you have already seen. And it just, devastated all of the crops that were in bloom, the type of stuff that couldn't recover. Egypt was getting hit and hit hard. So the hail came, and again, it was economic destruction. This is a major famine threat. And at that particular time, Goshen starts to look like more of the breadbasket for Egypt, doesn't it? Because it's not being impacted by these things. And everything going on in the land of Egypt. I will tell you a bit of provision that God did. When the Israelites left, Goshen was still there and had not been destroyed. Just thinking ahead. What was the provision God was making for the people of Israel that were left? It was the land of Goshen, where his people had lived, so that there would not be absolute destruction in the land of Egypt, although the times after that would have been incredibly tough. Okay, Exodus 10, 13 to 15. Moses stretched out, because Pharaoh continues to rebel. Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and Yahweh sent an east wind over the land all that day and all that night. When morning came, the east wind brought the locusts. The locusts went up all over the land of Egypt and settled within all the boundaries of Egypt. The locusts were more severe than they had ever been before or would ever be again. They covered the surface of all the land and made it look very dark or black. They devoured all the plants on the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had spared. There was nothing green left on the trees or the plants of the field in all the land of Egypt. Locusts are like a traveling famine. I mean, they're awful when they show up and start to eat everything. Locusts bring famine. And again, it didn't happen in Goshen, so guess where the breadbasket is. Suddenly, the people in Goshen are very prosperous because they have to provide the food for everyone else. And scarcity drives up prices. Now, the reason I'm bringing this out is because when your culture is shaking, if you're standing on the rock, there's always going to be opportunities. The Lord was giving Goshen opportunities throughout this horrible shaking of their nation, which they had to grieve over just like everyone else. I mean, no one celebrates destruction. No one celebrates the pain that other people are going through if they're healthy in their minds anyway. And so although they probably, they were being oppressed, okay. But it still was for them an opportunity because God was giving them the opportunities. They suddenly found themselves in the strategic place that they needed to be so that they were able to prosper in the midst of all of this. And that's what I'm saying to you, that no matter what happens in our nation, not only do we not have to fear because we're standing on the rock, not only do we have to not have to fear, not only do we not have to fear because God is our strength and our fortress and our deliverer, our present help in trouble, but God makes sure his people have opportunities and they prosper. So this is, an extremely important point that we get out of this story, but it doesn't just happen in this story, it happens in real life. I could have said, let's talk about the history of what happened when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD and what God's people who lived in Jerusalem, how they responded to it and what God did for them. But doesn't have all that biblical background to it. It's more of the history of our era. And so I said, well, let's go to one that we got scripture for. But the same thing was happening in that time because they heeded the word of Jesus. Jesus had said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out. Well, it seems like that's kind of a late time, right? Lord, couldn't you possibly have told us a little bit earlier? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, means the armies, one day you're just kind of working in your marketplace and someone says, hey, there's a foreign army coming. Its standards are cresting the hill. It's too late then to flee because they're about to encompass the whole city and they'll kill any stragglers that they catch out in the open. And so you huddle down in the city. And now it's like, well, Lord, you said when I see this, I should get out of Jerusalem, but I can't get out of Jerusalem. But Jesus knew that Titus would withdraw his troops. And he'd come back. Well, Vespasian would come back. Or Vespasian would remove his troops. I'm confusing which one is it which. One or the other did one or the other. Okay. But that was what happened. And then the troops, it was Titus that came back. Because I remember he tried to stop the troops from destroying the temple, and he couldn't get them to stop. And you know why they destroyed the temple? Because it was gold everywhere. And so they burned it so the gold would just seep down and they could collect it. And so they, that's how they did it. So, okay. Anyway, so God gave them the opportunity between the armies surrounding. When the armies left, because of the secession issue that was about to happen in Rome, when the armies left, it was all of a sudden all the Christians in Jerusalem who had heeded Jesus' word said, whoa, now we go. And everyone else is thinking, we won. It felt to them the same as when the Assyrians, the angel of the Lord, visited them, and so many of them died in camp, and they left. Well, these guys are thinking, God delivered us once again, and the Christians are going, we're out of here. He's delivered us for a temporary moment, that it's time to get out of here right now. And they left. And they didn't have to go very far, and, far enough, but then all of a sudden, when the Roman armies came back, there were the majority of Christians, at least, maybe all of them, were gone. So, okay, same thing here in this one. This one is one, I want you to think about the psychological impact of this one. Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand to the heavens, and darkness will fall upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that will be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand to heaven, and deep darkness fell over all the land of Egypt for 3 days. A man could not see his brother, and no one came out from under it for 3 days. But there was light for all the sons of Israel in their dwellings. Who knows what this was? There's actually no evidence from how it happened to let us know how it happened. What was it? Was it, a volcano in the middle of the Mediterranean had kicked off and the clouds settled on Egypt and there, it was black, and no, you couldn't see anything because of all the blackness of the smoke and everything? Who knows? God did it somehow. He made sure that it was so dark, you couldn't even, if you're walking by someone on the street, you couldn't see them. You just couldn't see them. If you were in your house, because remember, they didn't have glass windows like we do. You were in your house. This atmosphere was in your house. You couldn't see. And so people did not move about. They just did not. They didn't come out. They didn't move about because they could not. But for some strange reason, in the land of Goshen, there was light for all the children of Israel in their dwellings. Okay? Now, it doesn't say outside their dwellings, in their dwellings. That may be a clue that it was something like a volcano or something that had done. That there was, some people say a dust storm. I don't know if a dust storm would get quite that dark. I think of ash and a volcanic eruption getting that dark, but I don't know if a dust storm would do it. And it doesn't say. It could have been a supernatural event too. We don't know. So, okay, so the darkness that can be felt, but there was light in Goshen. Again, a distinction which was being made between the people of Israel and the people of Egypt. And then the last one, Exodus 11, 4-7. Moses said, "Thus Yahweh says, about the middle of the night I am going out into the midst of Egypt. All the firstborn of the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the maidservant who is behind the handmill, as well as the firstborn of the cattle. There'll be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, like there has never been before or will ever be again. But for all the sons of Israel, a dog will not bark at any man or animal, in order that you will know that Yahweh has made a distinction between the sons of Egypt and the sons of Israel." Now remember, the Israelites had to participate in this one. They had to do the blood on the doorpost. This is Passover, okay? But do you like that picturesque expression, a dog won't bark? It's kind of like dogs bark at everything, right? You got dogs, a loud car goes by on the road. Okay? That was my barking impression. We should probably cut that out of the video so someone doesn't make a loop of it. Yeah. Too late. But anyway, so obviously, this is big difference. You got this other stuff happening, and it's so common in Israel that even the normal stuff isn't causing the dogs to bark. It was that peaceful. It was like a special peace came on the land of Goshen. Well, the outcry was awful, and you understand why the outcry was awful. Okay, I wanted to go through this. Egypt shook. Egypt was destroyed as a nation after this, especially when Pharaoh and his troops end up chasing the Israelites and they're destroyed. Egypt was like at the mercy. It was just laid bare. And in the midst of the destruction of a nation, God protected his people. And I believe that even if the United States is destroyed, God's going to protect his people. That's the point. We don't have to be in fear. We don't have to say, oh my goodness, we got to make it. No, we don't have to be in fear. Doesn't mean we don't provide. Doesn't mean we don't, make preparation. And if you believe there's going to be supply disruptions, right now, there are people who are saying make sure you have in your house enough food to eat if there's a short disruption of supplies, etc. And that's easier said than done when you don't have a basement. But rice stores really well. So, okay. Anyway. And then finally, Jesus said this. Luke 12:32. "Stop being afraid, little flock, for your Father has willingly chosen to give you the kingdom. And the kingdom is where his power is, to turn everything Satan is doing upside down." And so that's what we are doing. We're trusting in him. Do not be afraid. No matter what happens in our culture. Do not participate in the fear of our culture. Don't participate. And just simply say, I've got a rock. I can't be shaken. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this opportunity today to study what happens when a culture is shaking, no matter the cause, and that your people can expect that you will move on their behalf, that you will help them because they have been building their lives on you. And I ask, Lord, that any of us that haven't been doing that would get with the program so that we will not be shaken no matter what shakes in our world today. I pray in your name. Amen. Thank you. And let's see. Either of you have anything for the streamers today? Okay, then I'll tell them, go. Hey, nice having you with us today. God bless. I know I saw at least one of the streamers with a large screen TV or a big TV watching today. We got a text message with it in. So nice to have you with us today. And Friday night, 7:30, next week, Sunday at 10 o'clock. God bless.